At predominantly white institutions such as Miami University, each and every student of color goes through this journey. They go down this path where, in order to make it to the end of their 4-year experience, they must endure the additional burden of being subjected to everything from endless streams of flippant racism to microaggressions and hate crimes, to having to excel in order to be noticed. This should be considered a state of emergency. These students pay the same amount of money as white students, but receive a fraction of the protection and support they so deserve. These students add value to both the classroom and the community. Worst of all, these experiences are not a monolith. Each one is unique and detailed, and if you listen closely, perhaps you will begin to understand.
My name is Priyana Kalita. I'm from the state of Assam in India. I use she, their pronouns. I'm double majoring in sport leadership and management with a concentration in coaching and women, gender, and sexuality studies, and I'm a senior this year.
My name is Janie Kamara. I am a senior double majoring in Black World Studies and diversity in leadership.
My name is Taylor Dancer. I am a senior, and I am currently a student teacher at a school a few cities away.
My name is Brandon Small. I am a 4th-year senior here at Miami, and I am majoring in political science and English literature.
My name is Ariana Mack, and I'm a junior public health major working on a combined master's in health promotion with 2 minors in global health studies and medical humanities and a certificate in global readiness.
My name is Ojin Lee, and I'm currently a senior majoring in AYA Integrated Science Education. Over the last year, our lives have been changed significantly due to the pandemic, the loss of many of our loved ones, the high unemployment rate, and crazy online Zoom classes. But most importantly, there has been a significant increase in Asian hate crimes. You might say, oh, that didn't happen here. What do you want me to do about it? But you and I both know that the hatred and hostility towards international students have always been high at Miami. It is just more noticeable than before. It was so common to see domestic students unwilling to sit next to Asian students in class, making snarky comments while moving away from them at Kroger, or even yelling at us to go back to our country when we would be walking in uptown late at night. But I'm not here to talk about the big issues like the pandemic or the hate crimes. I want to address this very situation at Miami and what has been going on even before this past year. I couldn't help but notice so many microaggressions occurring in the classroom and on campus. What I'm going to talk about right now is a universal experience. You would have probably seen this in your own classes. International students not speaking up in class, not being proactive in your group work, or speaking in a way that may not make sense to you. Before I get all into it, let me start by telling you my own story. I was born in South Korea, but I moved to China when I started first grade. I then had to move to Singapore in 3rd grade and spent 7 years there. Just when I began to think of Singapore as my own home, my mom made my brothers and I move back to Korea, and I attended an international high school there. Although my nationality was Korean, I never felt that I was truly Korean. I never even attended any Korean local schools before. I was never accepted as myself. To my Chinese friends, I was too Korean to be Chinese. To my Singaporean friends, I was also too Korean to be Singaporean. But to my Korean friends, I was too Chinese, too Singaporean to be a Korean. And now they tell me I'm too American-minded. What does it even mean to be Korean, to be American? I'm sure that many of your social justice, race, or education classes tell you that race is not important, that it is merely a social construct. However, there is this dissonance between people refusing to be defined by their race and yet still weaponizing it against others. I'm sure many of you will say that race isn't important, nationality isn't important, sexuality isn't important, that we are all human and that we should love and accept each other for who we are. But is that reality?
What would you do if I asked you to humanize Black people? Would you listen after I tell you about all the ways in which you don't? I'll start with myself. I was asked to contribute to a recording of a campus tour in March of 2020 when everything transitioned online. My particular segment covered residence halls on campus and their amenities. In the comment section, there was a comment that reads,
I used to love Miami, graduated in 1980. No love lost. Might as well be in the Bronx, not Oxford. It's your skin color, not your grades or SAT score that now gets you in.
I would like to remind you that in this video, I only talked about residence halls. And as a result, my value as a student was questioned. And it wasn't because he had any proof that I was not well academically suited to attend Miami, but it was because I'm Black. So, in the white man's eyes, of course, I wasn't accepted into Miami as an indication of my merit. I had to be filling a quota. That is how random racism is. Because my anonymity to this white man had him make the judgment that I am unqualified because all Black people are incapable of intelligence and scholarship. Why does the color of my skin determine my qualifications to attend this university? Why is it that I am not allowed to have any other characteristics outside of being Black? Why is this the case for every Black person I know? You see, there is a prominent perception that Black people are lazy, and there is much opposition to subsidizing that said laziness. But when Black people pursue education, they're stealing spots away from those who deserve it. And when they get hired at a job, their hire was just to fill a quota. Then when Black people ask for anyone to invest in their communities or ask them to stop divesting in their programs in education, they're begging for handouts. Yet when they build their own communities, programs, and infrastructure, they are unable to receive a loan, and in cases like Tulsa, Oklahoma, they're massacred and lynched. If you don't see the pressure on Black people to assimilate, but you want to control the education and wealth Black people have access to, then you are a hypocrite. We are both victims to a system of racism that refuses to let Black people have power. So let's talk about it.
No fats, no femmes, no Asians. These words still rang in my ears as I recently and begrudgingly downloaded Tinder again after deactivating it for the first time in years. Despite hearing these clearly awful sentiments online before, I had personally never experienced anything as bad. The COVID-19 pandemic forced us all to recede to our homes and reimagine our relationships with technology. And with that, we began having to rely on our technology for interacting socially, going to school, taking meetings. And with this was one of my only options for meeting people, I decided to try the app. And to my surprise, it was actually going pretty well. I was getting a good number of matches and having great conversations. That was the case until I received a message from this one guy that I was super excited to have matched with. He was attractive, went to my school, and seemingly had an interesting personality from what his bio described. And to my excitement, he messaged me first. But my excitement quickly turned into confusion when I saw what he had sent me. What are you? What am I? Confused, I asked him to clarify. Where are you from? What race are you? Oh, okay, we're going there. I told him that I was biracial, half Black and half white, and asked him why it mattered. Nice, sorry man, I'm only into white guys. I could be down to experiment though. Is what they say about Black guys true? And once again, my interest in having a Tinder account diminished. I deactivated my account once again soon after. Today, I want to talk about beauty. I think that we can all agree that there are things with an objective essence of beauty. Flowers, for example, are commonly seen as beautiful. My favorites are hydrangeas. This is something that we learn from a very young age is beautiful, and we've never really been challenged on it. So let me try to now. I want you to imagine the most stunning photo of a landscape you've ever seen. For me, it's watching the sunset over the beaches of Hawaii. Have it in your head? Now try to convince yourself that this is average, no more interesting than your backyard or a local park. It's hard, right? That's because there are things that are socially, culturally, and structurally agreed upon to be beautiful, and it is extremely difficult to subvert those. But what makes a person beautiful? Well, in the same way that we are taught to know that flowers are beautiful, we are also socialized to view certain human attributes as attractive. This is perhaps most evident in how we perceive celebrities. Typically, the celebrities seen as the most beautiful or attractive would be those who are visibly thin or physically fit, have a youthful look, perfect skin and teeth, and, with some exceptions, are usually white.
Right before our spring break, an event occurred called Dashiki Day, in which students were encouraged to celebrate African culture by wearing dashikis. Just for context, the school I attend is predominantly white, and this includes the staff as well. My cooperating teacher attended a meeting and questioned whether or not this idea of Dashiki Day was appropriating Black culture. He also spoke for the 2 Black staff members and said that they should be consulted before going forward with this event. Long story short, their concerns were not addressed and Dashiki Day went as planned. The reason why I bring this up is that this is not an isolated incident. This is just one of the many stories surrounding cultural appropriation in America. So we need to understand exactly why incidents like these are so harmful. Over the course of this presentation, I'll break things down into multiple parts. Part 1 is for defining what cultural appropriation is. Part 2 is dedicated to the numerous demonstrations of cultural appropriation in our everyday lives. And the final part, Part 3, is made specifically for the why do I care people. In short, I come to you tonight to explain and to educate you about why cultural appropriation is harmful to the Black community. It is an extension of centuries of racism and oppression. I'd also like to acknowledge that cultural appropriation is not something that happens exclusively to Black people. Any and all minority groups have experienced cultural appropriation, yet because I don't subscribe to all minority groups, I'm going to talk about the group I do subscribe to. Part 1. What is cultural appropriation? To give you an academic definition, cultural appropriation is the adoption of one or more elements from one culture or identity by a person from another culture or identity, typically someone from a dominant culture. To give you an even simpler definition, listen to these words from the brilliantly talented Amandla Stenberg.
Appropriation occurs when a style leads to racist generalizations or stereotypes where it originated, but is deemed as high fashion, cool, or funny when the privileged take it for themselves. Appropriation occurs when the appropriator is not aware of the deep significance of the culture that they are partaking in.
It's no secret that white Americans are the dominant culture and majority in the United States. Common examples of cultural appropriation include, but are not limited to, acrylic nails, Black hairstyles, and Miami University on Halloween night. We see you in your culturally inappropriate costumes. You know who you are.
I came to Miami with the intention of learning and gaining knowledge about myself as a Black queer woman in America, and to understand how students can drive and lead movements to transform campuses into healthy and safe environments that promote growth and creativity. Today, I'm talking with you all about racial capitalism and the ways that students can support marginalized students who feel unsafe and unwelcomed in this community, while taking back your power as students who pay to attend this institution. Let's get started. Let's first define capitalism. Capitalism is an economic and political system that is based on private ownership of the constant means of production and operations for profit. Now with racial capitalism, Dr. Cedric Robinson, a political science and Black studies scholar at UC Berkeley, describes it as the process of extracting or gaining social and economic value and benefits from someone's racial identity, typically Black and brown people. The history of racial capitalism is not only the history of whips, plantations, and slavery, but also unfair wages, overworking in an increasingly violent society, and the creation of this faraway idea of freedom for Black people in this country. So how is this present on college campuses and at Miami? Well, through diversity, the buzzword of the last 10 years. It is plastered across brochures that boast about the promise of an inclusive and safe experience. It's talked about in admissions interviews, but while the word itself is popular among universities across the country, the practice of diversity and intended creation of inclusive spaces for students are often lost in translation. When addressing issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, institutions focus solely on a student's race or identity, oftentimes overlooking other interests and identities, thus creating the student as a form of capital. Miami University loves to construct images of diversity, but it's not shown in its attitudes, practices, and policies. Marginalized students are alienated from this community because of the indoctrination of all students with values such as love and honor that lead them to abandon the material, social, and political interests of their communities. The presence and parading of token minorities is often done to mask larger structural inequalities, as there is this colorblind approach to addressing issues of diversity at Miami, which enables racist practices that maintain and upkeep systems that oppress our community members. Let's talk Miami demographics. Here on Miami's main campus, of a population of 16,522 students, 12,472 students identify as white, which is 75.5% of our campus population. 594 students identify as Black and African American, which is 3.6% of our campus community. That's a huge margin to work with. In Miami's image construction of diversity, the university places Black and brown students on their advertisements to attract these students, but never take the time to actually educate them about the realities of being at a primarily white institution. There is this extra unwarranted responsibility that's placed on Black and brown students as they are expected to serve as educators in an environment where they pay to learn. This places a strain on Black students as they routinely experience white racism in classrooms, residence halls, faculty and academic advisors' office, libraries, and other public spaces adjacent to the campus. It is not my job to teach people in my community who are actively harming me. The university lacks to tending to the needs of Black and brown students while expecting them to solve issues of DEI. The extraction of labor and life from communities of color within our community and around the university exploit their labor and profit from their narratives of trauma. These examples show a practice that reduces one's identity to their only visible characteristics and often regards the less visible aspects. This limits personal expression and categorizes students only in a minority lens. Universities are spaces that aim to educate and protect its students, but this practice only benefits the predominantly all-white institutions themselves more than the well-being of the minority students that it targets.
Wrong. Wrong was a word I was bound to be familiar with since the day I could remember my existence. My grandmother used to tell my mother that I was a boy born into a girl's body. I walk like a boy, I wore clothes like a boy, etc. My skin tone was a lot darker than they had expected and wanted me to be. I was, and still am, a victim of colorism every day. But regardless, there goes another wrong thing about me. I grew up in Guwahati, a tiny city in the small but mighty state of Assam, in probably the most diverse country in this world, India, around these notions of being wrong. As I was growing up, insecurities surely started kicking in. For example, I loved wearing t-shirts and shorts, but most of my friends who were girls dressed in skirts, tops, wore makeup, etc. This is surely still the case. On the other hand, my wardrobe matched the clothes of my friends who were boys. Since I was a kid, I always thought that the clothes were good unless one was uncomfortable in them. But then as I grew older, I realized that the problem was not with my wardrobe, but the concept of the gender binary my family members had in their minds. I remember there was this one time my family had saved up to visit the capital city of New Delhi for my birthday. I feel as if I was in around 2nd grade and I wanted an Aquario Beyblade for my birthday. Beyblade is a miniature modified top and is made to battle with other Beyblades. It was and still is a popular cartoon show, and most of the Beyblade owners in the show are either men or young boys. My parents knew what a Beyblade was, as it was pretty famous at that time, and everyone was buying them. They did tell me that I was going to get a Beyblade, and that moment was probably one of the moments that I have felt enormous joy in. But that didn't last long, as they told me that I would have to wear a dress when we go to see the Taj Mahal in order to get my Beyblade. Now, as I had mentioned that I didn't like wearing dresses, but my family would never stop their efforts to make me wear stereotypically feminine clothes. And I did have to wear a dress and stay in it the entire day of my birthday. Surely I was not happy at all. But I did what I needed to do in order to get my Aquario Beyblade. It felt wrong for me, but for my parents, it felt correct. As I started growing up, the word wrong or the feeling of being wrong started growing up with me as well. I played on the streets with the boys by my home. My grandmother told my mother that playing outside with the boys was wrong. So my mother put me in music, dance, and art classes. And I felt wrong being there. Then my mother put me in tennis. And listen, everyone, tennis is the reason for my existence in this country, and I am currently attending Miami on a full athletic scholarship. But still, I felt and I still feel wrong. Why? Because other girls wore skirts and tops and I wore shorts and shirts. Why? Because my family tried to change me, change the way I was, tried to make me wear skirts, tops, and dresses. I still go through this, and the feeling is not something I can suppress.
Now picture this. You travel across the world, spend 20 hours on flights to a new country, a new school. You're so excited to meet new people, experience a whole new culture. You hear all these amazing stories about how the United States of America is one of the most advanced countries in the world. But the actual experience was never close to the expectations. Now, how would you feel if a person asked you for a different name just because they don't know or aren't sure how to pronounce your real name? When they don't try, even when you try to help and repeat your name multiple times? When you've been in a class for 3 months and yet the professor still can't say your name right or confuses you with the other Asian student, it's so hard to feel that sense of belonging. It feels like you're denying our identity, our culture. How would you feel when your professor asks you to form a group for a project in class and you notice everyone refusing to make eye contact with you? When people expect you not to speak English and praises you for being able to have a normal conversation? How would you feel being called on every single time the class has a conversation about diversity or inclusion, knowing that your opinion may be misinterpreted as a representation of the whole Asian culture? How would you feel if people just assume your nationality by your appearance? How comfortable would you be speaking in front of a class in a second language? They tell you to speak up, be more verbal, and for that, you get mocked for your accent or mispronunciation of words. I know I've been asking you to think about being in my position, but I also wonder about being in your position. I wonder, how would it feel to just enjoy walking around uptown, especially at night? To not be scared about walking past a group of drunk people. To not think about how to respond if they come say ni hao or yell at you for being Asian. How would it feel if I could just focus on my classes without having to worry about being judged for my accent or my academic abilities? How would it feel to not have the pressure to prove myself constantly, to prove that I'm different from all the other international students who are thought of as that weight in class? There are so many battles that I and all the other international students have to fight against every day in class and on campus. If you are feeling uncomfortable listening to these questions and still choose to ignore actions like the ones I've described, then you are also weaponizing your whiteness. Other international students and I have constantly voiced our opinions and asked for change over the years. I've been listening to their voices since I was a freshman, and now I'm a senior. Sadly, I can't say that there has been a change. Year after year, it keeps repeating. Even from the previous RC 101s, we had panelists talking about this issue. Year after year, this same issue will come up if you choose to turn a blind eye to this situation. Talking about this is not progressing. We need substantial change.
The major purpose of education is not only to learn how to approach the text we read, but also to approach the conditions under which we live. Angela Davis. It is a job of the university to provide spaces for minority students to express themselves and engage in any capacity that they choose. All students need to feel that they are in a campus community that supports and values them, where learning opportunities are developmental, and where they feel a strong sense of identity. As a Black woman on this campus, it is not easy to say at times, I do not feel safe to exist simply because there are members of our community who see my skin as a threat to their existence. I've experienced microaggressive attitudes and languages and forms of intimidation, invalidating my experience at this primarily white institution. And the same can be said for so many students, as we saw this summer with Dear Miami. Each and every one of us has a role in protecting, educating, supporting, and empowering our community and sustaining this. But we have to do the uncomfortable work of calling out people to call them in. This is not an easy process, and oftentimes individuals react with resistance, avoidance, or just dismissal. But to raise one's awareness of their actions, you must first make them aware of the harmful impact on the community. So how do you not only create an awareness of harm while educating yourself and others? Well, let's talk about the 4 years of your Miami experience. Well, first, understand that as change makers, actions truly do speak louder than words. Making a commitment to action is about making a commitment to choose a path that disrupts the white supremacist structure. It's about being critical of how the university cares about you and educates you. Next, understand that building a movement is a horizontal process rather than a linear, as there is no one voice that speaks for students, but rather a collective voice to generate movement.
Part 2, cultural appropriation in everyday life. Let's take a look at cultural appropriation in the media. If you're not a fan of the Kardashian family, this presentation might not be for you. Celebrities in our society are often credited as being trendsetters, but what happens when the supposed trend becomes appropriation? Let's analyze some case examples, starting with the ever-evolving Kardashian clan. Case study 1, Kim Kardashian. As always, there is so much to unpack here. In 2018, Kim had cornrows done and called them Bo Derek braids. For those of you who are not familiar with Bo Derek, she is a white actress who wore cornrows in a movie way back in the 70s or 80s. This is cute and trendy until you learn that many Black individuals are turned away from jobs every day due to unprofessional hairstyles, much like Kim Kardashian's Bo Derek braids. For the record, these are not boxer braids. These are not Bo Derek braids. These are cornrows. In 2017, Kim came under fire again after her makeup brand, Kim Kardashian West Beauty, released contour and highlight kit ads that portrayed people in blackface. In 2019, Kim appeared on the cover of 7 Hollywood magazine with darkened skin. In reaction to this, people began calling her a culture vulture in blackface. Just because you like having sex with Black men doesn't mean you get to steal from Black culture. Blackface is never okay. Not only is it extremely offensive and racist for Kim to do this today, but it also bears a striking resemblance to the days of minstrel shows, which gained in popularity after the Civil War. Minstrel shows involved white performers painting their faces black, enlarging their lips, and portraying stereotypical characters that dehumanized and degraded Black people, specifically recently emancipated slaves. Kim Kardashian doing this in this day and age is every bit as problematic as those who did it 100 years ago. Case study 2, AAVE, or African American Vernacular English. The use of AAVE has often been a point of contention for this generation. Many words, such as lit, bae, cis, woke, and ratchet, have increasingly been used by people who are not Black. This seemingly innocent form of internet language is actually a form of cultural appropriation. AAVE has been nationally recognized as a dialect with unique grammatical structures and vocabulary. It is also a more sophisticated and efficient form of English than standardized white American English, and the grammatical constructions include the deletion of to be verbs. Yet, oftentimes, it's referred to as ghetto English by people outside of the Black race and culture who insist on using it for clout. For reference, people like Iggy Azalea, Aquafina, and Miley Cyrus have made their entire careers on and profited from the appropriation of Black culture and AAVE. Now, I am not asking anyone to completely cut out those aforementioned words from their vocabulary. This is certainly an impossible request. However, I ask you to not pretend that those words were invented by teens on Twitter, TikTok, or Stan culture. AAVE is a form of English created by enslaved Africans who mixed West African language structures with the master's language. Black culture is not something which you can occasionally steal from. Also, saying words without knowing the meaning can result in quite an embarrassing moment for you. Case study 3, hair and clothing. In the fashion industry, marginalized subcultures are often excluded at the outset, but when a style or trend they display is ultimately embraced by the mainstream, the subculture's contribution is often disregarded. To use a part of someone's culture as inspiration and exclude people of that culture as well is a form of theft. Many of you may have seen Adele sporting a Jamaican-themed bikini top, as well as wearing Bantu knots in her hair for the Notting Hill Carnival, which is held annually to celebrate Black British culture. Yet, I don't see this as a good enough reason to appropriate Black culture. Not to mention the countless Black men and women who have been discriminated against in the corporate world because their hair is natural and not chemically straightened. When you have to change your hair texture in order to get a job in the United States of America, seeing a picture of Adele, Kim Kardashian, or anyone else being labeled trendsetters might piss you off a bit. As of May 2020, only 7 out of 50 states have outlawed race-based hair discrimination. So that means that in the remaining 43 states, someone with hair like mine could legally be refused a job position based on the texture of their hair. Does that even remotely sound fair to you? If someone is prohibited from wearing their natural hair in the workplace or in a school environment, civil rights are gone and have never, in fact, existed.
The emergence of dating preferences is one that, while problematic, is somewhat understandable. We, especially now, are living in a culture contingent on performing presentations of beauty, sex, and desire. When we are constantly shown similar archetypes of beauty in media, or when the 19th muscular white man in a row is chosen as the sexiest man alive by People magazine, we naturally associate this type of person as being objectively beautiful, the standard for attractiveness and desire. And in our growing age of technology and communication, these perceptions are becoming increasingly dominant over individual perceptions of beauty and worth. I mean, take Tinder as an example. Did you know that your Tinder profile has a hotness score attached to it? An article from Vox writes that essentially the app used an ELO rating system, which is the same method used to calculate the skill levels of chess players. You rose in those ranks based on how many people swiped right or liked you, but that was weighted based on who the swiper was. The more right swipes that person had, the more their right swipe on you meant for your score. Tinder would then serve people with similar scores to each other more often, assuming that people whom the crowd had a similar opinions of would be in approximately the same tier of what they called desirability. But the issue here is that immediate perceptions of beauty are subjective, though they are also rooted in socialized perceptions of desirability. Thus, the Tinder algorithm effectively disadvantages people of color, of larger sizes, disabled people, etc. The most beautiful white people will naturally be pushed to the front of the line and swiped on more, while those with less desirable traits will only appear once all other options have been expunged. Dating apps like Tinder perpetuate Eurocentric standards for beauty and actually limit connective opportunities for marginalized people. This is especially true in the gay community, and as someone who is a gay man and a person of color, I am no stranger to the dark side of preferences. Gay men exist at a very interesting intersection, both enjoying the privilege of identifying as a male in a patriarchal society, while also largely being other due to their sexualities. Psychotherapist Mitchell J. Wood comments in his research that one of his gay male clients asked him, "Why is it that every time I see a beautiful man, I feel self-loathing instead of pleasure?" Gay men have become one of the faces of body dysmorphic disorder, or BDD, which refers to an excessive focus on one's perceived physical flaws, ranging from body shape to skin clearness to general attractiveness. And while this disorder generally affects men and women equally, the effects that it has on especially queer men differ and are oftentimes invisible or untreated. In a study conducted by the American Psychology Association, men with BDD were more likely than women to be concerned with issues involving muscle, and they were less likely to work due to the distress that BDD caused within their lives. Additionally, the National Eating Disorder Association, or NEDA, has found that research shows that beginning as early as 12, gay, lesbian, and bisexual teens may be at higher risk of binge eating and purging than heterosexual peers.
The hypocrisy in the treatment of Black people is rooted in dehumanization. Dehumanization occurs in stages and starts with assimilation. Assimilation is the absorption of a person into the culture or tradition of a population or group. It's the intention of making a person as similar to another cultural group outside of their own. Eurocentric features, values, and functions are preferred in this society, whether it's through media or academia or even how beauty is perceived. So, for Black people, this looks like being told to tame our hairstyles so that we can better fit into the workplace, or not playing our music in certain spaces. Assimilation is actually the exact opposite of inclusion. Instead of embracing qualities or ideas and having it contribute to society, there's an erasure of an entire culture. For example, there's a difference between getting a person acclimated with a new language to be functional in a new place and stripping them of their native tongue. Well, Black people have been stripped of so many things in the name of assimilation. We have been stripped of knowing our history. We have been stripped of teaching our history. We have been stripped of equal pay or even adequate pay at that. We have been stripped of expressing our ideas or being creative, and we have been stripped of being anything except what the white man tells us to be in that moment, or else we are limited in how much we can participate in society. In my case, I was stripped of my ability to just be a student talking about the school I attend. Instead, I was stereotyped by someone I have never met because I'm Black and assumed unqualified. This case demonstrates two different folds. The first demonstrating the pressure on Black people to assimilate, and the second fold comes from the ideology behind stereotyping, which goes beyond prejudice, bias, and ultimate racism, but dehumanization of Black people. Have you ever said you weren't surprised when you hear about crimes committed by Black men in the news? Have you ever said you weren't surprised about a crime committed by a white man? Or have you ever said that there are higher Black-on-Black crime rates than the rate of police killing Black people? Yet have you ever described white crime as white-on-white crime? Or have you ever called a Black person protesting a monkey? Or have you ever quantified someone's qualities by their race? For example, I'm smart for a Black girl. I'm pretty for a Black girl. I am well-behaved for a Black girl. These statements just quantify by being a Black girl instead of just qualities I can possess, like any other person that may not be Black. Othering Black people to the point of dehumanizing them is not a new concept. It's an inherited ideology. Scholarly European literature in the West had race and nation derived from the same concept as lineage or stock, as in animal stock. Race then developed into a scientific theory that formed a hierarchy of people as a result of thinking that people of color had to be different species from being the same as white people. Our own history of American law was founded on Black people being 3/5 of a person.
I wanted to get out of Guwahati, get out of India, and go somewhere where people would accept me the way I was. I wanted to come to the US, as the American dream is promoted as it is for everyone. But to my surprise, things got worse when I came here. Not only I was made to feel wrong and alienated, but was told that people like myself didn't deserve to live. Now I'm going to talk about some incidents which might be a trigger for people. So I want to give some time for everyone to get ready for this or take a break if required. In 2017, I was referred to as "What is that?" by the camera person on roster picture day. In 2017, I was asked if I could just wear a skirt for once to look good on roster picture day. In 2018, I was referred to as faggot and asked, "Why are you even here?" by a student outside our famous bar, Brick Street. In 2019, some athletes in the training room talked about, why do gay people play sports? Why are they even existing? When I was there getting treatment in the training room. In 2019, I was told to leave the women's bathroom as according to the person, I was using the wrong bathroom at the prestigious Farmer School of Business. The next incident that I'm going to talk about actually threatened my life. In 2020, which is last year, I was talking to my teammate outside our house when an intoxicated individual from behind started referring to myself as I want to talk to that guy several times, which left me a bit uncomfortable. Therefore, I decided to just walk away. But then the situation got a bit heated, and the individual started to refer to me as faggot, pussy, and various other derogatory terms and almost came chasing me. But I was lucky that my teammate and my other friend were there to keep me safe, as I was not sure what I could have done alone, as one thing which kept on coming into my mind was about, does that individual possess a weapon?
Michelle Obama said in her YouTube commencement.
It starts where change always starts. In your own home, in your own social circles, in your own neighborhoods, at your own dinner tables. Sometimes it's easy to stand with strangers at a protest than it is to challenge someone in your own backyard.
That's why I'm here, talking to you. Change should start here in Miami, in our own classrooms. Everyone should feel safe and welcome in Miami, and that can only be achieved if you are willing to change. I hope what you felt today is not just a moment, but a stepping stone for you to think about how you can change and work towards making yourself better and Miami better.
So, here's your book of Miami. Chapter 1, freshman year. Education, education, education. Obviously, you are here for this, or else you wouldn't pay $30,000 to $60,000 to come here. Education here means understanding the institution, its patterns, and the ways it distracts students from the reality that they are living in. Question everything. The more time that you spend on campus, the more that you'll begin to realize that not everything is as it's made to appear. Talk to upperclassmen about their experiences. Attend events and take classes that are dedicated to critical thinking and expand your consciousness. Get to know the student activists and leaders in your community so that when it's your turn to step into your role, you know who to turn to for advice. Chapter 2, your sophomore year. This is focused on awareness. It's focused on breaking the social norms of silence. There is not only a social culture of silence, but an institutionalized culture of silence that enables people to create and maintain harm. During my sophomore year, I was a part of an organization where 2 individuals said the N-word, and instead of this organization calling out this behavior, they continued the harm by defending these individuals. As one of the 594 Black students on campus, what good does it do to my mental, physical, and psychological safety when community members do not call out ignorance and expect me to do so? So take the time here to go out to the community to organize from the ground up. These tactics can look like creating a culture of community that shares information about their experiences with other students, faculty, administrators. It looks like working with different student groups to hold rallies or teach-ins. Have a vision and a purpose when you hold these events and make sure that people know what they're expecting to hear. And it looks like holding universities accountable for their promises through public callouts and campaigns. Chapter 3, junior year, the rebellion. It is this question of loyalty. In Miami's mission statement, you'll read, it is deeply committed to student success, builds great student loyalty and alumni loyalty, and so on and so forth. My question is, can you be loyal and critical? We are loyal to each other by helping each other become our best selves, which is why we are critical of how this university cares for us. It's time to get uncomfortable and build a movement. You've had 2 years to understand the Miami that exists and the Miami that you want to create. So write down those goals as well as what the things can be passed down. Next, create some short-term goals and sets of corresponding demands, making sure that they are specific, measurable, realistic, and time-specific, so that they put pressure, maintain commitment, and are strategic as we are only having 4 years to be here as students. Chapter 4, your senior year. What legacy will you leave? How will you sustain this movement? You're a senior who's burnt out, like myself, so focus on archival work and passing on information to underclassmen through mentoring and guidance. Your role here is to leave a legacy to empower the students after you to sustain this movement.
So if we take these issues, if we reflect upon the ways in which there seems to be a shared sense of bodily trauma and stress within queer spaces, why is it that these can still be so wildly exclusionary? The fact that no fats, no femmes, no Asians has been popularized on apps like Tinder and Grindr is exemplary of the internalization of each of these things. Gay men being held to and subsequently holding themselves and others to standards of fitness, performative masculinity, and whiteness. That last part is especially important. It's not enough to have a perfect body. It's not enough to be masculine, whatever that is. Because what good are these things if you're anything but white? When we say things like, I only date white guys, or I'm not into Latinos, what does that say? Is it really a preference? The popular narrative by members of white, privileged classes would seem to think so, but this is reflective of the oppressive beauty standards and body politics that have quite literally, mentally and physically oppressed people of color, fat people, and those who express gender differently. These statements are racially charged and exclusionary. Even in just saying that you will only date blank type of people, you are also simultaneously saying that you will not date others specifically because of their race. And while couples are becoming increasingly interracial, they still only compose of 10.2% in the United States. And research shows that white people are the least likely to seriously date people of color, yet are the most likely to fetishize them. The number of matches that marginalized people get on Tinder is hardly their most pressing issue. But these preferences are reflective of larger structural forms of othering that do have major, long-lasting effects on self-perception and self-worth. For so long, I hated myself for not looking the way that most people would agree was hot or beautiful. But what I realized this time downloading Tinder was that I will never be that. I can't ever be like that. And it's not because I can't work out more and have a perfectly flat stomach or a six-pack. It's because I'm not, nor will I ever, be white. And I cannot, nor will I ever, confine myself to a box of rigid masculinity for the sole purpose of desirability. And so, at best, I'll be a fetish.
There is a pipeline here between assimilation and systemic racism. Systemic racism intends to maintain Blacks and other minorities in inferior positions on the basis of race, achieved through the discriminatory practices in almost every institution in our society. It's discrimination in what homes we have access to. It's discrimination in the quality of education at our schools. It's the laws that disproportionately affect Black people. It's redlining Black people so that they can't get homes in the neighborhoods they desire. It's intimidation practices to keep Black people from voting. And it's gatekeeping who has access to quality education. It's using a Black woman's tissues to advance the entire body of cancer research against her knowledge and never personally compensating her. It's the history of America. Now let's bring it here today. Systemic racism is rearing its ugly head in front of us through the current pandemic. The CDC hospitalization and death rates report that Black people are almost 3 times more likely to be hospitalized for COVID than their white counterparts, and almost twice as likely to die from it. This is because socioeconomic status, lack of access to healthcare, exposure to the virus in the workplace as an essential worker, and misdiagnosis of diseases that could lead to unknown underlying conditions are all results of a system that is fixed against Black people and literally harms them. Black people are perceived as burdens, used as resources, then treated as a threat. We are seen to be leeches on society when we may be on welfare after historically being at a socioeconomic disadvantage. Then we're exploited in a pandemic as essential workers and as sources of creativity in all forms of media. Yet, when we're sleeping in our homes, or jogging in our neighborhoods, or entering our homes with a lunch, we are killed. If society cared about Black people just for being human instead of hating them or exploiting them, if society just thought Black people were people and thought that was enough to be worthy of living, of receiving education without being questioned of value based on just skin color, then we could reach it. We could reach a society that humanizes each other.
Similar but worse incidences of misgendering happened to Rhea Milton when she was killed by a man in Liberty Township, which is a mere 35 minutes away from the campus of Miami. Similar but worse incident happened to Larry King when they asked a boy in their class to be their Valentine, and that boy shot Larry. Similar but worse happened to Dustin Parker, Nulisa Luciano Ruiz, Yampi Mendez Oroncho, Scott Scotland DeVore, Monica Diamond, Lexi, Joanna Mutzger, Serena Angelique Velasquez Ramos, Leila Pelaez, Sanchez, Penelope Diaz Ramirez, Nina Pop, Hale Jae O'Regan, Tony McDade, Dominic Remy Fels, Jane Thompson, Selena Reyes Hernandez, Brian Egypt Powers, Brayla Stone, Mercy Mack, Shaki Peters, Bree Black, Summer Taylor, Marilyn Cazares Dior, H. Ova, who also identified as Tiffany Harris, Keisha D. Hardy, AJ Raquel Roan Spears, who also identified as Rocky Roan, Leah Rayshon Dye, Key Sam, Arian Burnett, Mia Green, Michelle Michelin, Ramos Vargas, Felicia Harris, Brooklyn Deshona, Sarah Blackwood, Angel Unique, Skylar Health, Uniski Carey Herrera, Asia Jaine Foster, Shai Mashia Sims, Kimberly Fael, Jahem Poch Jahem Barbie, who also identified as Bella, Courtney Eshe Key, Alexandria Winchester. Most of these people were Black, brown, trans, and non-binary. These are the reported misgendering killings for the single year of 2020 on the website of the Human Rights Campaign.
So what did you want to leave here? What did you learn? Miami loves diversity, but doesn't do enough to support its diverse students. As a teaching institution, it is our goal to pursue knowledge and truth. So pursue and disseminate knowledge in ways that benefit and uplift marginalized communities that embrace decolonial ways of knowing when necessary. It is easy to become overwhelmed by, for a lack of better expression, the fuckery that Miami gets up to. But it's important that we stay vigilant, critical, and active. As students at this university, given all of the harm that Miami causes, it is imperative that we take on the responsibility of holding the university accountable and working towards its eventual destruction. Saying it again for the people in the back, you have a responsibility to do something about Miami's fuckery now that you're here benefiting from it.
Part 3. Why should I care? There is so much more I could talk about in terms of cultural appropriation, but I'll leave you with this. Because you are watching this, you now know the definition and implications of cultural appropriation. Now, there is no excuse. When you leave here, educate yourself, educate your friends, hold everyone you know accountable, recognize how harmful cultural appropriation is to Black people, but also take the time to realize how cultural appropriation affects minorities and other communities. This is a coalitional movement. Just because I talked about the Black community doesn't mean that other communities are exempt. This hurts them just as much as it hurts us. The United States benefits from Black culture, but does not love Black people. Whether it's stolen Black labor or stolen Black culture, white people continue to perpetuate anti-Black oppression for their own violent profits and privilege.
So, what is there to do but abolish the standards on Black people that come from a place of wanting to erase our culture? Being human should be enough. It should be enough to have rights. It should be enough to be respected. But for Black people, it's not enough.
When we talk about racial consciousness, it's sometimes perceived as though this responsibility falls solely on those from privileged backgrounds. And while this is especially the case for them, we all share a responsibility in developing an intersectional mindset. The LGBTQIA+ community serves as an example of how even a highly marginalized space can perpetuate things like racism and the further marginalization of others. And so what we need to ask ourselves is, even if I am marginalized, how can I best equip myself with the tools of allyship and avoid marginalizing or othering those around me?
Death, being the result of expressing oneself in this country, is not acceptable. All these people are people who have lost their lives to the crime of misgendering is not acceptable. These people deserve to live their lives and fulfill their dreams, live the American dream. But they are failed. I am failed So many people like myself are failed every day because the American dream doesn't look like us, doesn't have people who look like us, doesn't have people who have hopes and dreams like us. Therefore, now, who is wrong? Us or the American dream?
So, I have now done my part by speaking. It's now time for you to do your part by acting. After today, what will you change? Thank you.